So as I mentioned, we're here under the umbrella of the new urban design program. And this is the beginning of a series of conversations about the challenges, questions, and opportunities of urban design. And so we'll have a series of these conversations in the months ahead. So please stay tuned. Before I'll come back to the systems, roots, and bits part, but before that, I would like to acknowledge that the Gensler Family AAP New York City Center, which you see here, is located on the unceded homelands of the Lenape people. And we offer this acknowledgement in recognition of the original people of this land, the Lenape, their resilience in the face of settler colonialism and their deep connection to this place. The land that the Lenape occupied before the arrival of European settlers is known as Lenapehoking, the land of the people, and it's an area that includes New York City and extends from western Connecticut to eastern Pennsylvania, and from the Hudson Valley to New Jersey and Delaware. Lenape nations, communities, and individuals live in locations spanning the world, including 5 federally recognized nations in Oklahoma, Wisconsin, and Ontario. We acknowledge the painful history of Lenape dispossession and attempts of erasure, and honor the continuous connection of Lenape people, past and present, to these lands and waters. And saying this acknowledgement with an image like this on the screen, I think it's impossible not to imagine the kinds of complex entanglements that any urbanization process embodies. And I think this is one of the challenges of engaging questions of urban design is reckoning with the incredibly complex and difficult histories. But one of the things that I'm really hopeful about is that urban design is also at its heart an incredibly optimistic enterprise. It's something that tries to understand the histories of the city, the processes by which the city forms, but also in an effort to try to envision other kinds of futures that might yet become possible. And more than just imagining those, looks actively for ways to try to bring them about. And I think for me, this is what I'd like to try to discuss tonight, and also what the program is hoping to do. And I think in the context of an urban design program, we know that the city is not such a stable entity, which is why I love this painting from Ed Ruscha, that it acknowledges that this thing we call the city is actually more like a complex process that is constantly being renegotiated and is much less stable than we might imagine that it could be. And so the program endeavors to investigate urban metabolisms and the synergies between ecology, ecologies, technologies, and cultures that point to the dynamism and the possibilities of the city, such as it is. The program is now accepting applications. You can find more information here on our homepage. There's the URL. And we are based at the very end of Manhattan at 26 Broadway, the Standard Oil building. An irony that we often discuss, what does it mean to be exploring a post-carbon future from what once was the seat of the problems in many ways, but it gives us this amazing perspective on the region. It's a place that's embedded in the middle of the city, but it also allows for some refuge from the city, and it's this amazing place to try to understand and engage this place. So tonight, systems, roots, and bits. The idea is to discuss the ways in which we might think about urban design not as a process of not as a collection of stable volumes, but really as a process of transformation. So infrastructures, places, or communities. So what brings us together, for better or for worse, the things that unite us, and how we come to think about our relationships to one another. and then the systems of data that are increasingly underpinning those processes and those relationships. And I can't think of a better group of people to address this. And so I'm so delighted to be able to introduce our panelists tonight. And we'll have a series of short statements from each of the panelists, and then from there we'll have some discussion with hopefully questions from the audience. So we're really thrilled to have everyone here, and I'll introduce them all at once. I won't be able to introduce them properly. If I were to do that, we'd be here for far too long. But it's such a luxury to have such a brilliant group of folks joining us. So we'll start with Lydia Kallipoliti, who is an assistant professor at the Cooper Union, who's the curator of the Tallinn Architecture Biennial, and also the author of The Architecture of Closed Worlds, or What is the Power of Shit? And Lydia, I think the perfect person to talk about questions of urban metabolism and transformations. Next, we'll hear from Ross Exo Adams, who's the co-director of the B.Arch Architecture Program and also assistant professor there. Also is the author of Circulation and Urbanization. Following that, we'll hear from Peter Robinson, who is the founder of WorkUrban, founding board member of Blackspace Urbanist Collective, and also my colleague at Cornell AAP. We've been teaching studios side by side this fall. From there, we'll hear from Adam Lubinsky, principal at WXY, professor of practice at GSAP, and also our neighbor in downtown Lower Manhattan. And then the last two panelists, Nuria Zhang, who is teaching in the computational design practices program at GSAP, and also works with Delve and Google, thinking about the relationship of technology to the city. And then finally, we'll be joined by Sean Rickenbacker, who is the director of the Max Bond Center at City College and also an associate professor there. So again, I could go into much more detail about all of these brilliant people, but I think in the interest of hearing from them and starting our discussion, I will turn it over to Lydia, and then we'll go from there. So Lydia, thank you again for joining us, and I'll stop sharing and hand it over to you.
Oh, hi, everybody. Thank you so much for having me. I'm really excited to meet all of the brilliant panelists and participate in the opening discussion for this new program. So I'll just share my screen. I have to say that I'm not really, if I have to describe myself, I wouldn't describe myself as an urbanist. I'm mostly an environmental scientist and architectural historian. And I am going to speak to you about pipes and shit. And shit is a term that I'm using as a subtitle of my book, The Architecture of Closed Worlds, or What is the Power of Shit? So to begin, I'm going to share a kind of talk which starts from the most anti-urban landscape that we can ever think of, another planet. And as much as this image from the NASA's Perseverance rover is a real image, it is also an invention of emptiness. And it is extremely problematic to speak about a planet, because all of these discussions and the kind of very contentious schemes of Bezos and Elon Musk to inhabit other planets are extremely burdened relative to the history of colonialism, especially if we consider the plan to extract resources and conquer newly found territories free from jurisdiction. This narrative of exploration, of course, is entirely bound to the history of colonization, where different power structures establish their dominion. So, of course, I'm not advocating for anything like this. I'm not advocating for the power dynamics of relentless capitalism, but it's extremely interesting to think of this type of habitation in a different way, not as an escape of a privileged population, but as a drive to project new ways of living on Earth. Research on life support systems on Mars, for example, force us to face our shit on Earth where resources for sustaining all forms of life have been abundant for the most part since the Enlightenment. Not until recently have we been mandated to consider their finite worth or replacement or deal with the excessive waste we generate as a byproduct of daily production processes. On Mars, where every resource for sustaining life is precious and rare, waste becomes integral to our survival. There's no distinction between what is waste and what is resource. So this view changes our viewpoint on how to retain and recycle waste. And this is what I will speak to you about today. Because I think that these kinds of possibilities can contribute greatly to discussions on climate crisis and cities. So when we think of how to inhabit another planet, and this is just snapshots from a project that I've done with a synthetic biologist called Justin George for the London Design Museum a while back, we basically think how to speculate to live in inhabitable digestive machines. We think of how to live in giant vessels of ingestion and excretion. These types of living machines display beyond function modes and trajectories for existential change. As anthropologist Valerie Olson argues, habitation in that light is reconceptualized. Dichotomies that are traditional, like inside, outside, body, building, environment, are systemically transfigured. So understanding how to design such spaces depends largely on the regenerative properties of Earth-based biology and our ability to engineer and tinker with resources through the field of synthetic biology. And of course, living in a machine is nothing new, not a new desire for architects at all. It is, in the history, we have famous examples ranging from Le Corbusier's machines for living to Rainer Banham's environmental bubble, and so forth and so on. But we're not going to discuss about machines as a kind of assembly and disassembly logic of interconnected parts and the deep anxiety of how industrialization has forged new paths of architectural production. We're going to talk about two different reasons of why these questions on waste and machines become important. First of all, in space habitats, machines are not just infrastructure that solve problems of resource distribution. There is no distinction between an inhabitable space and a mechanical space. So the logic of material conversions generates new alliances between, let's say, a toilet and a garden, a bioreactor and a bathroom, a kitchen and a laboratory, a bed and a virtual reality environment. The prospect, therefore, of converting output of one space as input for another, which at first sight seems programmatically unfit, forges new typological and experiential coalitions. Overall, this project, as many others, proposes capturing waste and converging it to various usable forms. It also proposes systems where humans, their physiology of ingestion and excretion, become biological parts of the system they inhabit. So Mars forces us to look at questions of space colonization in a visceral way, not through the domestication of a new frontier and the supremacy of technology, but via the raw ecology of our bodies. Recycling, therefore, is not simply a statistical problem that we may relate to the management of urban resources, but it is also a basic bodily reality that affects the water we drink and the air we breathe, available for our survival. On Earth, cities like New York create an enormous amount of shit, piles that we cannot see, nor do we wish to see. In fact, metropolitan environments which aspire to become global leaders in their environmental objectives, like New York carbon neutral by 2050, export their waste in order to reach their statistical goals and essentially displace problems of health to less fortunate populations. As reporter and environmental activist Oliver Millman wrote in The Guardian, a substantial amount of New York's feces is expelled to Alabama, causing major methane clouds 900 miles away. The treated sewage, euphemistically known in the industry as biosolids, travels by a poo train, this particular train to a landfill west of Birmingham, causing what the locals call the death smell. In Alabama, this avalanche of northern poo is a wide concern over the environmental risks for residents, particularly the impoverished and people of color. The dismissal of environmental concerns from Alabama residents, mostly residents of overwhelmingly African American communities, has been reported as a case of civil rights and environmental racism. These relationships of importing and exporting human waste forces us to delve deeper into the geochemical affinities between capital and excrement. While waste displacements are highly curated, they transfer problems to marginalized terrains. Therefore, the question of how to handle, retain, pile, decompose, and redistribute waste is not simply a technical problem of trading carbon emissions, but it is also a matter of justice and equity. This is precisely where Mars, the faraway destination for the elite, can potentially become a useful model for alternative building systems. Retaining waste on site and designing infrastructures on how to live with, say, an anaerobic digester is an opportunity with long-term environmental and health benefits, despite the upfront cost of investing in spatialized infrastructure. For the most part, our relationship with the raw biological realities of our output in all their glory and filth is still a taboo expelled from daily life and discussion. In designing infrastructural machines that recycle waste to energy as inhabitable living spaces, the premise is that humans can coexist with the material consequences of their bodies. For example, in the toilet garden space, feces are separated from urine and digested in an integrated toilet garden social auditorium space. So I'll skip because I think there's so many speakers. It's important to think that as a philosopher of technology, Langdon Weiner has argued, there is no idea more provocative than the notion that technical things have political qualities. The turn of the environmental discourse, almost exclusively to the technical dimension in the past decades, prevents its examination in philosophical, social, and political terms, which could reflect on new collectivities and living patterns in the contemporary social and urban sphere. I'm going to skip this part and on a kind of note to say that besides being about materiality, recycling is an ideational apparatus. The cycling process of ideas is a form of resistance to a project's linearity or causality in response to defined problems. Recycling becomes a disruption to the very prospect of an idealized continuum or a productive distraction to the arrow of time. As Heinz von Forster argued, it is favorable to have some noise in a system, for it is not simply information that matters, but also noise. What appears as noise at one level of reference, one scale, becomes useful input in another scale. Such is the case in this line of work. This position asks architects as creative thinkers and citizens to investigate processes in the full spectrum of life, in all its living systems, materials, and components, as a complex intertwining of overlapping ecologies and the way in which they unfold in space and time. It reflects the condition of the world as a heap of waste, a coagulation of ideas, bodies, platforms, objects, displaced from context and history, our world of climate emergency, health crisis, and social inequity. And with that, I want to thank you for listening.
Nice. Lydia, thank you so much for starting us off. And I appreciate everyone's willingness to go along with this kind of short set of inputs for our discussion, but there's going to be so much to talk about, so I want to just keep us moving along. But I'm already super excited to be able to keep talking. So we'll continue onward to Ross. So Ross, please take it away.
Okay. All right, I'm hoping you're seeing what I'm seeing here. Okay, well, thank you, Jesse and everyone for organizing this and inviting me to join the conversation. It's really, I think, a very important set of questions that you've put out to us to address, and I think more so like engaging with questions of urban design in general are, I think, a very important side of critical invention and so forth. So happy, I'm really looking forward to the discussion afterwards. I'm going to go kind of quickly through introducing myself and sort of suggesting a few things that I think are important to take into consideration for an urban design program. Very briefly, my work, as Jesse mentioned, I have a book called Circulation and Urbanization, which I can talk about in just a second. But roughly, I think with my research in the past, I've kind of positioned myself somewhere between architecture / urban design and urban geography. And these two disciplines, I think, offer really interesting potentials to kind of work with in between, which maybe we can talk about again later. But specifically thinking of architecture as always a very future-oriented practice, while also being kind of a more conservative field and discipline than others. And I think urban geography is much more aggressively critical and so forth, but lacks a kind of ability or language to think about imagining other worlds and so forth. So I think there's a really interesting potential there. But very loosely speaking, my work is really interested in the relationship between ways in which we organize space, specifically what I think about as a sort of history of urbanization, and ways that that space always implies or has always brought with it a kind of form of governance. And I trace that one historically, again, through the work of Serda and my book on circulation and urbanization. That's very much a kind of an epistemological genealogy, a genealogy of ways of thinking and forms of representation that managed to slip into practices and concrete forms of power and governance and so on. The other side of my work is much more rooted in the present, in thinking about ways in which our urban design has kind of reemerged recently around questions of climate change and certain problems that attend to that practice. So I think it's a really important question, and I think Jesse put this out to all of us, and it's something that I often think about, and in a way to really address for me what is urban design. I think it's first important to understand what we mean by urban, or urban space, or urbanization. And again, for me, that's not something that's sort of equivalent to a transhistorical condition of like the city or something like that. But as I argue in my book, the urban is something that is actually somewhat recent as a spatial order, and something that perhaps lacks a kind of a strong enough theory, let's say, in history of its own to be able to talk about in a sort of sense that we can kind of compare notes and so on. When we think of urban design, I think we tend to think of, the practice today as rooted in something of a kind of mid-20th century post-war practice that emerges with Patrick Abercrombie in 1943, I think, when he first coined the term urban design. And then, of course, Joseph Louis Sert establishing the first degree program at GSD in 53. And we can sort of imagine that there's a kind of continuity of that sort of discourse and the practices that came around from that that continue into the present. I actually think that I would describe it differently. I would think that there are sort of two periods where we have this sort of emergence of modern urban design. They're very much related, obviously, not just in name, but in other kind of more conceptual ways. And the kind of urban design we have today. The first sort of generation, urban design 1.0, if you want to use a lame terminology like that, is something that very much emerges as a response to crisis. The post-war cities that need to be rebuilt, but they're also driven by, they're creating a sort of zone for experimentation to take place. What we have now, I think, is something much different. it's much less organized by a kind of welfare state. It's much less organized around a kind of control and management of a population, for better or worse, as it was in sort of 20th century European practices. And it's now driven far more directly by a financialized global capital, and specifically the real estate market. And I think this is something that we should really acknowledge, especially as the sort of idea of urban design responding to crisis is something that's coming back into this practice as well, obviously in the case of mainly of climate change, but increasingly crisis as understood by contemporary urban designers is really understood as a sort of generic term for anything from terrorism to flooding to whatever else it might be. So I think it presents us with a kind of strange situation where urban design increasingly seeks to work for a kind of select public, and public might not even be the right term when you have entirely privatized districts and cities emerging, and testbed cities, as Jesse very much well knows with Sondo here, emerging all over the place. So it's a very different way of thinking about a rationality, very different way of understanding crisis, and a very different way of understanding who the publics are that this serves. Something like resilience, which is which is a term I've been researching a fair amount, and that I think everyone here knows really well, has also been something that I think is fascinating in the sense that it really makes explicit the practices and the sort of intentions, if you want, although that's probably not the right term, of urban design. On the one hand, urban design, as resilience is showing, is not about saving populations and people, as in the kind of modernist modalities, let's say. It's much more about maintaining systems. And I think when we start talking about systems, things get a little bit challenging in those discussions, especially because we as architects tend to create the propaganda that shows things otherwise. So what are the systems we're trying to maintain? Real estate capital, as in cases like Miami, is very explicitly the system that's meant to be maintained. But also the driver of urban design today is dominantly, private real estate capital, again, financialized capital that's going around the world. And because urban design, things like Hudson Yards, for example, real estate itself is a really good place to kind of park your capital in space in times of crisis. We have to really understand, who it is we work for as urban designers and what it is we're doing with our practice. Despite all of the good intentions we tend to embrace. I think what we need to be much more direct in terms of dealing with are things like class and race and so on, and how these are becoming spatialized in perhaps larger urban geographies than, or perhaps even maybe the same urban geographies that we can trace in the various like redlining practices of the 20th century and so on. And we add on to that massive investments in infrastructures for resilience that, of course, are only place specific. They're not going to entirely save a whole city or a whole region. We have to talk about things, as again many geographers and sociologists are talking about, such as climate apartheid. These are, I think, real potentials that we are in fact contributing to in many cases, and we can see that where things like resilience, when applied in, let's call it the global north or sites of capital accumulation, resilience looks like a wonderful new interface and an opportunity, right, to reestablish relations between a kind of tranquil, anti-climate change nature, like there's no existence of climate change in the sort of image on the left. Whereas when resilience is applied through development and international development agencies and things like that in spaces of capital extraction, we have a very different system, a very different kind of outcome of displacement and expropriation and forced movement of populations into new relations with capital that are often very disastrous. So I think in other words, I think when we're working with urban design, we also tend to address questions of race and class and so on through representations. And as important as representation is in images that we see like this, where there's, by the way, there's a this one guy who's constantly used, the guy with the stroller. He appears in every image these days. It's kind of crazy. Where what we need to be looking at is what these images sort of refuse to show, right? The kind of the invisible boundaries that are built by necessity when we create certain zones and districts that are climate resilient, leaving others then exposed to the kind of disasters that await us for sure in the future. So 3 priorities for urban design, if it can be as didactic as that. One I think is important for me is to not treat urban design or urbanization or urban issues as simply matters of the present, but to really understand their kind of historical and epistemological roots, and to trace, as I would argue, the emergence of the urban as a kind of space process, urban and urbanization, as something that inherently stitches modes of power into the organization and management of space is quite crucial. We can only just recall that the term urbanization is a very recent term. And I think when we start unsettling these sort of common sense notions that we think urbanization is like an inherent human quality, when we start seeing them as something maybe assigned to other social systems like capitalism and liberalism, then I think we can begin to ask other questions of the spaces that we are talking about today. So I'm principally interested in looking more directly at relations of coloniality and the sort of systems that were created, again, as a sort of response to the sort of protocols of extraction and so forth, to relate things like the plantation system to industrialization and so forth, to see that as all kind of sediment that would allow for a new kind of space to emerge in sometime in the 19th century in Europe, and then of course becoming somehow re-exported after being boomeranged back from the colonial spaces. I think in the present sense, rejecting normative professionalized limitations that we tend to take, I think is crucial. I personally think, and what we try to put into practice here at BARD, is to remember that design in general is kind of, again, a future-making practice. And I think it's important to, embrace a kind of a more, let's say, adventurous, that's not the right word perhaps, but a more, let's say, radical imaginary of what could be, if not simply, reformed, slightly better versions of the present, which has plagued urban design and architecture, I think, since the beginning of time. Just this quote from Stefan Harney: "Resilience is the name for the violent destructions of things that won't give, won't form, won't bend when access is demanded, won't be flexible and compliant." And lastly, I think to do this, it can't simply be like, just imagining what everyone kind of thinks about, but to realize that there are lots of things happening outside of architecture and design that are, taking a kind of imaginary approach, but very seriously. Things like the degrowth movement is very fascinating, for example, but also working with various groups, activists and so forth on the ground is also something that I think we need to become more agile doing. So with that, I will leave it.
Fantastic, Ross. Thank you. Thank you so much. And you can blame me for the slightly didactic structure, as I appreciate your the listing of these things. Again, all of these things are kind of teasers view, because there's so much amazing content with each of these each of our speakers tonight. So it feels somewhat cruel to hold you to such short amounts of time, but I appreciate that very much. And this becomes, again, the beginning of what I hope to be a much longer set of conversations. And so with that, we'll continue onward. Our next speaker is Peter Robinson. Peter.
Hello, and thank you for giving me the opportunity to share my work and practice and ideas about teaching here with you today. So I'm Peter Robinson, Assistant Professor of Social Justice, part of the Social Justice and Equity cohort in the Department of Architecture at Cornell. I'm also the founding director of WorkUrban and a founding board member of the Black Space Urbanist Collective. I'm also vice chair of the Board of Trustees of the AIA New York Center for Architecture. So I just wanted to share some of the work of our studio over the years, which has sort of always been a marriage between architecture and urban planning. So in the sort of loosest and configuration, it was kind of a way to think through issues of urban design at the scale of architecture, working in community. So the work, both in terms of the studio and my practice, sort of a roots up response to a sort of broader conversation about how systems can impact and be sort of useful to the most underserved communities around the world. And so as I go through this, I'm sharing a few words from Darren Walker's From Generosity to Justice. Darren Walker is the president of the Ford Foundation, and over the last 4 years has become the leader in a kind of transformative approach to social justice and social impactful work. The way we work can easily mirror the imperfect systems that created us and can perpetuate injustice rather than remedy it. Advancing justice means addressing systematic issues, not just their symptoms. It means listening carefully to the needs of communities and giving a platform to the individuals and institutions that are closest to the problems themselves. If you treat people like peers and partners in your process, the reward is a warmer welcome into the community, along with far deeper knowledge of the problems you're trying to address and what solutions are worth trying. And those advantages are critical if your ultimate goal is real, lasting justice. It is incumbent upon everyone to ask themselves, whom can we include and learn from? Whom can we support and lift up? What can we share based on what we've learned together? How can we work together to achieve this transformation? As I mentioned before, we're the founding board members of the Black Space Urbanist Collective. Black Space's vision, Black Space demands a present and future where Black people, Black spaces, and Black culture matter and thrive. To achieve this goal, we work to create a list of 14 principles that are part of our Black Space Manifesto, and I'll be sharing a few of them this evening. Choose critical connections over critical mass, quality over quantity. Focus on creating critical and authentic relationships to support mutual adaptation and evolution over time. We were a group of architects, artists, planners, storytellers, and urbanists who share this unique sort of vision about how Black communities can thrive and how we can be participants in that thrivance. We work principally through workshops, utilizing our manifesto and rudimentary sets of tools that allow us to create transformative engagements through model making, visioning, discussions, and challenging each other to think beyond the obvious into how our communities can be spaces of thrivance. Manifest the future. Black people, Black culture, and Black spaces exist in the future. Imagine and design the future into existence now, working inside and outside of social and political systems. One way of achieving that, after 1 year of working in Brownsville, Brooklyn, and we've been working in Brownsville and East New York, Brooklyn for over 5 years now, was to co-create with the community the Brownsville Heritage Conservation Playbook. It's a tool I use both in the studio and in my own practice. There are a set of best practices for working with and engaging effectively in communities. Respect, correct, collect, reflect are these sort of terms and phrases that are nonlinear and can be sort of utilized within the context of practice to ensure that we're working collaboratively with communities and always sort of checking ourselves in our sort of worst impulses. Plan with, design with. Walk with people as they imagine and realize their own futures. Be connectors, conveners, and collaborators, not representatives. I'm sharing with you some of the work from past studios, starting in 2019, where I collaborated with fellow Black Space board member and founder, and also fellow Cornell alum, Ifoma Ibu. The collaboration,
sorry to just jump in. I think we might, the screen sharing might not be active. Maybe just double check
Oops,
the toggle there to make sure that
I'm sorry. So you haven't been
no,
seeing anything?
well, you were speaking so persuasively. I wasn't sure if you were speaking, just
Oh,
focusing on your text, but
okay.
just since you mentioned it.
Whoops. Oh, so you missed a lot. Okay. All right. Sorry about that. I was watching the screen. Okay. Sorry. All right. I won't go back. So our studio works collaboratively with the Brownsville community and with community partners. Our first collaboration was Cordy and Lewis Allen, the founder of what was then called Made in Brownsville and now Youth Design Center. So our students are working in communities on a regular basis to sort of consider what solutions to issues that are raised by the community could potentially be. And so we're constantly sort of moving in the space of community with members of the community with our Black Space Manifesto as a tool of engagement and inquiry. Be humble learners who practice deep listening. Listen deeply and approach the work with an attitude towards learning without assumptions and predetermined solutions. Take criticism without dispute. Our Melon Design Workshop. So while working in Brownsville, one of our first community partners was the Brownsville Heritage House. It's a collection of, it's a 100-year-old collection of Black life in Brooklyn that is locally curated by the community. Part of what we've been trying to do with the Heritage House, its partners and collections, are find ways to support the collection being more accessible to the Brownsville community. So we partnered in the summer of 2021 with Darius James, who at the time was the director of design strategy at Gensler, and he worked with 6 high school students from the Medgar Evers College Prep School, as well as Black Space, on a design strategy report for the Brownsville Heritage House. Next summer will be the second summer of implementation of the strategies that were derived with the students, working again alongside myself, my colleagues at Black Space, and the staff of Brownsville Heritage House, as well as the Brownsville community. Students travel to Cornell to share their work with our graduate seminar, Reckon with the Past to Build the Future. Meaningfully acknowledge the histories, injustice, innovations, and victories of spaces and places before new work begins. Reckon with the past as a means of healing, building trust, and deepening understanding of self and others. The final studio I'll share with you is on Being Property Once Myself, the studio that we just wrapped up in fall of 2022. We worked collaboratively with University, an ecological public health laboratory located in East New York, Brooklyn. The studio oscillated around our community partner being very welcome and having full access to our design studios at Tata on Roosevelt Island, as well as our students being sort of a constant means of support in the East New York community, whether it be working in community gardens that are supported by University or by working in the University warehouse space in East New York, Brooklyn. If you are working on social justice or social change, never take for granted that progress will be permanent. You must have institutions who are durable and ready at the drop of a hat for whatever the challenge may be to join you in that challenge. Just some shots from our final review. We privilege the highly credentialed class over the wisdom and knowledge that comes from living in, living with, and being impacted by the problem. The people who are closest to the problem are the people who most likely can help design the solutions. And so ultimately, we ended our studio with one-to-one scale interventions that were designed collaboratively with members of University and the East New York community. They reflect the programs of University at an accessible scale, at an accessible scale with the sort of resources of the studio. Nothing extra was brought into the sort of the conversation. All the projects were community led and executed with the support of the community for our students, by our students, with members of the East New York Community University. I just have a brief, short 3-minute film to share. I apologize you didn't see a lot of the earlier images in the presentation. And so what you're seeing is our mid-review event, again, hosted at our space. Hosted at our space on Roosevelt Island, where we had over 70 members of the East New York community, along with our community partners, share in the event. Thank you. Apologize you missed the top pictures. I'll show them later. Thank you.
Thank you. I think it was strategic. You've incentivized us to discover more. But really nice to see, and also I hope that one of the things we can come back to in our discussion is this question of pedagogy, and the ways that we can use the space of the studio and other formats to engage questions of the city. I want to. I know it's a little disorienting to keep hopping along, but I think this is we'll continue our journey. The next speaker is Adam Lubinsky from WXY. Adam, the floor is yours.
Great, thank you so much. And I will pull up my presentation and ask for confirmation that you can all see it. Is everybody able to see the screen?
Looks good.
Great. So thank you so much. I would say great to be back, even though we are virtual, but I spent 7 years working with Bob Alder and folks at Cornell, teaching an urban design studio to planners and landscape architects. So that was an amazing privilege, and it was amazing to be at that space at 26 Broadway. So really happy to be here and meet some of the next generation of Cornell instructors. Again, Adam Levinsky, and I'm here as a principal at WXY Studio and also a professor of practice at Columbia GSAP. But today I want to talk principally as a practitioner, and I'd like to start by talking about WXY as a kind of model for an urban design practice in New York City. That's a scary idea, to try and be a model for practice. So definitely, I'm sure I just put targets all over us. But it's really about aspiring to something. And what we've done at our practice is build an office of about 60 people, interdisciplinary practice of architects, urban designers, and planners. Our work is really rooted here in New York City. We've been working here for years. We work with New York City agencies, we work with neighborhoods and community organizations, and we also work with developers and landowners. And as a result of this engagement, it means that our projects often extend beyond the kind of scope. And for those people in practice, they know about scopes of work. Our work often extends beyond a scope of work into a kind of succession of projects. And those projects often shift within an ecosystem of community organization project, which may be a planning project, to a city-led project that may be a built project, to work with a landowner that may be looking at a rezoning. And so that culture of working in one place over many years and over many political administrations has resulted in a kind of unique perspective on places in New York City, and a kind of institutional knowledge of people and data and maps. And it's given us a desire to extend beyond, I guess, what you call the confines of a design firm, which I think Ross acknowledged is a kind of conservative practice by nature. Our work has started to engage with issues that aren't on the surface design projects. We work on issues like integrating New York City public schools or planning electric vehicle charging infrastructure. And while both of these projects examples are tied to places, what I'm often most engaged with is designing processes, not necessarily in the guts of designing the work itself. I trained as an architect. I did a PhD in planning. And when we design processes, I wouldn't actually see it as necessarily architecture or planning per se. So I'm starting with this view of the Rockaways, and I love this view of the Rockaways because it really shows how thin the Rockaways is, from beach to built environment to bay. And in between you have the Rockaway Boardwalk. And I'm going to talk about our work mostly through our work in the Rockaways. We got involved there, and hopefully I'll be able to shift my slides, after Hurricane Sandy, where essentially the boardwalk, which has really been the spine for the Rockaways, wound up in splinters and planks in many people's living rooms. And so we were brought on board with an engineering firm to redesign and rebuild the Rockaway Boardwalk in the years following Sandy. And when we did it, we didn't want to just look at it as one simple piece of infrastructure, but a kind of infrastructure that served many purposes. One that looked at it as a resiliency spine that was raised up and protected the area from flooding and storm surges. One that was a kind of social spine that really brought people together, as it always has. A mobility spine, essentially 5 miles of continuous bike path now. It never used to allow bikes on it. And also an economic spine, something that so many businesses hang off of. And so in a way, when we approached our work on the boardwalk, we saw it as a kind of transect. How do we really shift from beach to building and addressing all of these different kinds of things like biodiversity, resiliency, mobility, economic development along the way. And having had a whole range of projects to work on, we've been able to do that. And so Jesse asked us to think about 3 priorities for urban design. And when we do our design, you know, that first priority, which I think is clear to most people, is engaging in design of the urban realm as a kind of co-design process. It was so important to do that with the Rockaways because it was a place that had so clearly faced this kind of trauma of the hurricane, and people having died there, and also having had their spaces, their homes and their social space of the boardwalk disrupted. But I think for us, it was also a kind of lesson that any urban space that we enter into is one that's laden with history and a legacy, often of trauma, that needs to be addressed through a kind of co-design process. And for us, on the most basic level, one element of that co-design was looking at the materiality of the boardwalk itself, you know, where people were so familiar and so comfortable with a wooden boardwalk, but it clearly didn't make sense. And so we were showing up at workshops and people were standing on, walking on, holding these different pieces of concrete as we shifted to a concrete plank for that boardwalk. And so we spent several years working on the design of this resilient infrastructure, the boardwalk, which is now raised up and works to prevent storm surges. But in the last 2 years, we've been working on a very different kind of project, working with a group called RISE, which is a community organization, on the idea of planting the sand dunes that are adjacent to the boardwalk so that the sand doesn't blow away. So literally the planting of seagrass will make the community more resilient by holding that sand in place. And this project with RISE has really been one of a kind of community stewardship, really reimagining urban design as something that goes from co-design to actual stewardship by the community. So developing a planting plan, but also working with a group of youth that are learning essentially STEM skills. They're being paid, so it's workforce development, and essentially starting to take on the responsibility of land that is often publicly or privately owned, and maintaining it and doing that kind of planting. And then finally, I would say a third priority is something that I would call ecosystem creation. And this work, separate from our work in the Rockaways, builds off of our work with school integration. Again, something that doesn't immediately seem like it's about design, but what we've found is that a lot of our work in school integration has gotten so politicized that what we actually need to do is build up a kind of ecosystem that advocates for the public schools themselves. And so this is recent work that we're doing in District 13 in Brooklyn, which includes downtown Brooklyn, which has had this rapid trajectory of growth, jobs, and unfortunately, you've also seen loss of enrollment in the local public schools. So it's like, what's happening here, where we've got all of this growth, and then at the same time, gentrification, displacement, and a decline in the local public schools. So we've been working to create a network of partners of different civic institutions to support those local public schools. So I'll turn it back to you, Jesse, but I really wanted to look at urban design beyond that frame of typical architectural or spatial design into a whole series of new priorities of co-design, working to develop stewardship and ecosystems of institutions and people. Thank you.
That's great. Thank you so much, Adam. I mean, I really, yeah, I'd love to. I think we can pick this up hopefully in the discussion around the one of the things we were talking about before we started with the other panelists is the you know, the particular polyvalency of urban design as a field, and the possibilities therein. So I think I appreciate your contribution in that direction to think about it, to think what some of the boundaries of it are. Fantastic. So we'll shift to our final two speakers. I'll turn it over to Sneria Zhang, again coming to us from the Computational Design Practices program at GSAP, and from Delve at Google. Sneria, thank you so much.
All right. Can everybody see my screen?
It's not full screen yet, but I see the side slides too. There it goes. Perfect.
Amazing. Okay. Hi, everyone. I'm super excited to be here. The talks just now were really amazing. I'm really inspired. So I am a designer, and also I have a background in math. I have worked with the MIT Sensible City Lab at architecture firms like Cometers and Fox, and I'm currently teaching at GSAP in the Computational Design Practices program. It's brand new as of this last year, and I also work on a product called Delve for urban design and urban planning at Google. So as you can tell by the slide and by everything that I just said, I have too many interests. And I think that's actually where my interest in city really sits, is that when you think about cities, all of these interests have to manifest. And there's tons of opportunities to really investigate, to use all of these different skills to investigate issues that come up in cities. So why cities? I think these figures are always really prominent for me when I think about the importance of what we do in cities, right? They're only about 2% of the Earth's crust, and 50% of the Earth's population. At that figure is quite old. It's probably by, close to 60% now, and 75% of the energy consumption and 80% of the CO2 production. So these numbers are really harrowing when you look at them this way, right? The kinds of decisions that we make in cities actually have really drastic effects globally. And some of the issues that made headlines in the last few years have always been there, but they have become more prominent and more present in our minds in the last few years. And these issues are created in cities by the infrastructure that we have. And then they're also solved and improved by the infrastructures that we create. So one part of cities that I spend a lot of time thinking about is the interstitial space between the digital and the physical, because the digital has really quite expanded along with the physical in the last decade, 2 decades, or even more, and that goes beyond just the internet. That goes beyond, your cars and your cell phones. There's tons of connected devices that are collecting data, that are improving our lives, as even though we might not be thinking about them as often or as actively. And that intermediate space is actually where a lot of my interest lies. So just to give some examples, I think data is everywhere, and that data really helps us understand our relationship to cities. So just to give an example here, this is the National Gallery East Wing by I.M. Pei, and it famously has this very thin wall that everybody loves to touch. And I hope that I.M. Pei really delights in this aspect of its creation. So because people love to touch this part of the building, you can actually see these handprints, these oil marks left by everybody going up to touch this part of the building. And what's really fascinating about this is that you can actually start to see this bell curve on the right hand side of the image. You can see that curve start to emerge, and because everybody is reaching out and touching this building at the most convenient height for them, you can see this curve because human height is normally distributed. So that data actually is naturally manifesting by the way that we interact with our built environment. And this can also be present, data can also be present in places that we're not looking. I'm really glad that Lydia brought up the topic of excrement and sewage earlier, because this is actually one of my favorite projects that I've worked on at MIT. Because there's always lots of data in sewage where we're not looking. Sometimes this data is analyzed at wastewater treatment plants, but that's usually further downstream, and the data fidelity is usually lost. So what we did is design robots that go down to sewage and start to collect information at the neighborhood level and see what they can reveal about us. And because they go down to sewage, we call these robots Mario and Luigi. So as I mentioned, I also teach at GSAP, and as part of the computational design practices program, we think mostly about the rise of computation. And because the construction industry really is one of the last industries to take advantage of the rise of computation, so we think about the relationship of the built environment and to the amount of data that is now available and the kinds of questions that arise with optionality and with simulations, etc. And the question of interfaces also come up often. So I'm also glad that Ross brought up Sondo, which is what you see on the top right, left-hand side here. When Sondo was built, there was this conjecture that there would be screens everywhere, right, at bus stops, inside buildings, and this is how we are anticipated to interact with the built environment, is through these pervasive screens. And they didn't anticipate that we would actually end up carrying screens with us, our personal screens, everywhere. So these built-in infrastructure is actually not really needed, right? So going from this kind of massive control room to something like Link NYC, to something that's much more personalized, how does that relationship start to manifest? And that is exactly the interim between the digital and the physical that I'm really interested in. And of course, as we're speaking about computation, I would be remiss to not mention all of the explosion of AI generated art, AI generated text that's come up in the last weeks or months. And so, for instance, we now have the ability to feed in a prompt that says something like, make a model of a room in OpenSCAD, and it can be something much more creative than what I've done here. And it actually generates the code that is necessary to produce a room. And here you can actually see it has a pretty sophisticated understanding of what a room is, because it not only makes a space, it also starts to generate windows and doors and these kinds of circulatory ways to interact with the room. So taking that idea and taking that promise, we can start to think about what AI can do in terms of urban planning and urban design. And one thing that I find really fascinating is thinking about AI as a tool for collaboration. So if we have certain spaces that we're designing, can AI be the one that comes in and helps us with the task of negotiation and become more imaginative? And can this kind of infinitely extend in terms of urban possibilities? So I will leave that there and hand it back to you, Jesse.
Fantastic. Thank you, Scenario. Super exciting, and also dying to hear more. So I'm a victim of my own structure here, but thank you so much for sharing this work with us. And that leads us to our next and final speaker, Sean Rickenbacker, joining us as the director of the Max Bond Center at City College. So Sean, thank you so much for joining us. I'll turn the floor over to you.
Yeah, great. Hi, everyone. Good to see some familiar faces. Lydia, Peter, Jesse, and well, Adam, I know you by way of other people, so it's wonderful to hear everyone's thoughts and ideas and see the work as well. And also congratulations to Cornell for the launch of the new UD program. So let me just, I guess I'll start by sharing my screen. Just a minute here. And while I do so, just a little background. So I'm the director of the J. Max Bond Center for Urban Futures at the City College of New York. It is, in fact, we're within the School of Architecture, but it is, in fact, the Applied Research Center that with a focus on social and spatial justice, primarily within the urban realm. And so we do a number of things with regards to this issue of urban and urbanization and urban design. So let's see, someone just confirm that you can indeed see my screen. Yes, is that a yes?
I see it. It's yeah, not full screen yet, but I see the
About now?
it's on the way. There it is. Yeah, it looks great.
We're good? Okay, great. So, the center is located in New York City, which is what you see here in Upper Manhattan, and it's kind of an important aspect of the work that we do, which has a focus on New York, but also works elsewhere within the country, as well as internationally. And so one of the other things here that I'd like to mention, there's some repeat thoughts here worth mentioning. I really appreciated Ross's comment on urban as a spatial order. It's in some ways a very incomplete project, even in terms of how it's defined. But despite that, it is essentially a public interest project. And so the urban at the scale of the city in particular is something that the center focuses on. Can I advance? Great. Okay. So now, when thinking about urban design, urbanism, and cities, one of the things that when one looks back at history, the city has sort of manifests itself as a byproduct of policies and governance. So it's not entirely through all design, although design has a huge impact. But New York is a particular case study in regards to that. And there are policies that situate how development in real estate behaves in a place like New York. And one could argue, as it's already been mentioned, globally, that international cities also operate in a similar kind of mandate and function. And I would refer to this as the real estate state, a phrase coined by Samuel Stein. And that is a kind of independent kind of entity that has its own sort of mechanisms of operation and even tools by which it kind of orchestrates and manages how it produces, in this case, architecture and communities, neighborhoods, et cetera. And then looking at these cities, one starts to pick up on what one could argue are global patterns that are, for the most part, proliferate throughout the world, but they also show tendencies that one could dissect and begin to understand. Some of those tendencies result in this kind of incessant innovation, which comes about through manipulation in some regards of policies and those sorts of things. So what I'm showing here is some redlining maps that, if you don't know what they are historically, they predicted where money, not only predicted, but also sort of dictated where investments would be made throughout some of our cities, particularly here in the US. And the effects of those are still with us today in terms of how the city has developed. So certainly urban design plays a role, but you'll see that, in my opinion, policies and governance, including urban design, has participated greatly in this practice of urban making, and in many cases, in a very unjust manner. But when you look at these policies and governance in particular, as well as design, from the standpoint of the center, and we conduct this research through teams using students and faculty from different disciplines, there are some interesting sort of dichotomies and one can say inconsistencies with regards to even design and policy. So arbitrary applications in how land scarcity is developed and how that scarcity turns into increased value which may either produce certain opportunities or limit others, and certainly the impact that those decisions and policies have on things like affordability. And so, at another level, there is still at the urban level, as well as the architectural level for that matter, innovation that occurs, and in most cases for good reason. Through the timeline shared on this screen, going from the late 1800s all the way up to the 2016, and I would even say beyond that. But we go through these building types that make up a huge percentage of New York City, particularly with regards to its residential cores. And then at the very far right of this slide is an indication of this kind of very tall, slim tower that we're all calling super tall, which are kind of a new urban phenomenon. And we ask this question of what's next. And more importantly, I think the super tall is really a phenomenon not necessarily born out of urban design and or architecture, but really out of the real estate market and the finance market, in terms of it being a rather strategic innovation of how to extract capital out of our land, out of our cities, and in the ways that serve that particular industry. And so here's an indication of the super tall, and what some of the things that we do at the center, looking much like Sonia, very heavily into the data of these things. So the value of a super tall versus something that's not that tall, you'd be surprised, is strikingly different. And so one asks, it begs the question, how is the zoning in this instance applied throughout the city? Is there consistency and or reason, or perhaps is it arbitrary and based on this figment of an idea known as character or scale, which is really sort of questionable. And so I mentioned previously that the real estate state and urbanism or cities, all of this development that we all sort of work towards to help guide or design and manage is really about extracting capital out of land, right? And in some regards, even extracting capital out of things that are not land, like the water side or water for that matter. And so this is a fairly important notion here because it suggests that if you're going to be interested or involved in urban design, one needs to kind of have a basic understanding of these other systems that are at play. And perhaps the most important thing is, as far as urban design is concerned, is to figure out a way to intervene in those systems. And so that's going to take a set of new tools, let's say, that I think that understanding urban data, understanding the new sort of potential patterns that can emerge based on ideas of health, equity, resilience, many of the things we've heard this evening, climate justice, climate change, migration, economic activity, and so on. And so, I really look forward to the conversation, but I think that in closing, I would summarize that I think to a large extent, the idea of urban design as an area of study is also, interestingly, an incomplete project. And I think the people here, as well as the potential students, are the future of how we might define it as it continues to evolve. Thank you.
Amazing. Thank you, Sean. And thank you again for everyone on the panel. There's so much on the table, which was part of my prompt to all of you. And again, I'm really grateful for your willingness to take it up. At the beginning of a new program about urban design, it seemed to me useful to ask the biggest questions, the most general ones. What is it? How do we do it? What should we do with it once we start to think about how to do something? And so I love all the things that that have been put on the table, but as a result, there's a lot of different sort of things to dive into. And so I'd like to try to offer a few questions that might allow us to talk across the the matrix here. And then also for everyone in attendance to, if you have questions about what you've heard tonight, or questions about larger urban design questions that you'd like to put to the panelists, please use the Q&A function, and we can relay those. But and also, of course, to the panelists, hopefully we can start asking questions across to each other as well. And just as a reminder, maybe just as we manage the discussion, we could use the little hand raising tool for now and see how that goes. One of my first questions, maybe to build on Sean's presentation, because it unites a number of the threads that have been unspooling tonight, in that it relates questions of data, questions of methodology, questions of urban drivers. One of the questions that I'm interested in, hearing everyone's reflections on is the degree to which the possibilities for which drivers beyond the sort of financial drivers might be possible, and how does one balance the aspiration to imagine alternative worlds, alternative economic worlds, alternative social worlds, with the grounded reality that currently is shaping cities. And so to one extent, if we look at what some of the things, for example, Lydia, that you were sharing, incredibly imaginative forms of infrastructural relationships, to then maybe what Sean, you were showing us around the ways in which engaging the very real and specific kinds of real estate instruments and redirecting those, to a scenario suggesting that there's emerging tools that can sort of accelerate this process, to then Peter trying to work on the ground with knowing the folks at University trying to think about existing economic structures, and then Ross connecting that to these broader historical patterns. It seems like there's all of these things are related, and so I guess my question is more of an encouragement or an appeal to see if anyone might be willing to expand a little bit on the idea of the extent to which we can seek out and try to model these alternative worlds, and the extent to which we build them incrementally. So is it something that you establish and work toward, or is it something that you work incrementally toward, or perhaps it's much more of a spectrum than it is a kind of binary? You can interpret that long string of associations however you want, and or if you have any reactions to it, I would be happy to hear them, as I'm sure our audience would be.
Well, I mean, I'll take a stab. I approach what we do at the center with this kind of forward projection that if things remain the same, we might end up at some sort of event horizon. I'm not sure what that horizon is, whether it's a economic or financial collapse, or whether it's a kind of climate-induced collapse or failure. But it's clear to me that we can't continue as we've been going along. And thus the possibility of imagining alternative futures, or in the case of the center, urban futures, is simply that this is almost in some sense precautionary. In other words, we need to do this. And so I think the question of the role of urban design is to guide us to how we might overcome the challenges we've created, whether they be economically induced or environmentally induced, justice induced, right? Because that's all part of what I would consider, again, the public project of the urban, right? So there's a lot of things that fit into that bucket. But perhaps I think it was Buckminster Fuller who said that designer needs to be part economist, part scientist, part artist, part journalist, right? And so many of these things are relevant to the urban, and so it requires a broad spectrum of attention and to be able to just even imagine, I think, how one might produce a viable alternative.
Sorry, yeah, please.
Yeah, I think part of what makes city building so hard is that it's difficult, almost impossible to experiment, right? In doing anything else, we experiment and we fail lots and lots of times. And that's how we make progress. But with cities, it's incredibly difficult to do that. And even in the processes of experimenting, there's always ways that we produce lots of harm. And so I think then the exercise of world building of these speculative methods is the value in those that I see is to find ways to experiment so that we develop a kind of knowledge and methods, novel methods in perhaps less harmful ways, or more generative, faster, more imaginative ways than is otherwise possible. So yeah, that's what I see as a big challenge and also maybe a big opportunity.
I think this question of experimentation and the kind of methodological challenge it poses is one I'd love to pick up again, because it does raise these incredibly complex questions of verification. But Adam, please, your hand is up.
Yeah, I mean, I appreciated both of those comments, and I think the question about experimentation is pretty open. Like, what I would press for is a kind of methodological experimentation, which which involves communities in a really different way. We'll think back to mid-century when we had an understanding of modernism where the public really was a kind of top-down public that was providing housing, providing infrastructure, and that the kind of methodological experimentation that I've been quite interested in is getting communities to take on understanding that energy and time and resources are limited, but that example in the Rockaways of a community-based organization stewarding a piece of land that's publicly owned, and the idea that the city is paying them for that, and young people being trained to do that. It's STEM, it's workforce development, and it's community ownership is pretty potent. And so really thinking about different kinds of experimentation along the way, and something that encourages a much more of a kind of bottom-up or a localized perspective on how to do these things, and then for urban designers to be partners in that, and not necessarily leading the way.
Just give me an yeah, Peter, please.
In my presentation, and I swear there were pretty pictures, I was doing a lot of quotes from Darren Walker's From Generosity to Justice. And one of the sort of the things he says in the early chapters of the book, because he's really critiquing the role of sort of philanthropy and as it's sort of tried to work in the most sort of challenged communities. And then, and he talks very specifically about the continent of Africa, and he goes, Africa is littered with the sort of failed experiments of philanthropy. And part of why this sort of continues is that the WHO gets to sort of evaluate and sort of measure or critique those results are never the people who are most impacted by it. So I think Jesse made a comment about this idea of verification and what is the role of, I think, our discipline in participating in that sort of verification. Part of it requires that there be a kind of a returning or going to the roots such that both the solutions and the problems that are identified come from the roots, the systems that we want to have the most impact in. And I think it obliterates that sort of top-down method. And what it does is the modes of evaluation then also comes from the roots. So we're out of that sort of that speculative space, and we're in a space that is sort of one that is really co-produced. It challenges us to really consider about what are the resources that we bring to the table, and what's the value of those resources, and what's the value of that engagement. I think part of the sort of the long answer to your question, and I sort of really appreciate a lot of the comments that have been sort of being generated by that, and this sort of leaning into experimentation. I think it's one of the things that as urban designers we sort of are the most skilled at, because we are, on the one hand, really sort of cogent and deliberate design thinkers, but we're also, systems thinkers. Urban design requires that you sort of think through modes of policy in terms of how things will be sort of achieved. That one, as one speculates, one has to sort of be grounded in sets of realities. The challenge then is for us to begin to sort of define or know what the most grounded realities are for us to speculate within. And I think that is the sort of, I think that the thrust or the kind of the long engagement to the sort of question you asked is, it's where do we experiment, and how do we allow that experimentation to be informed, and by whom do we allow it to be informed by, right? And how do we sort of participate in the solution, and then allow the metrics that evaluate it to come from the source rather than from us.
Thank you, Peter. I saw Lydia, your hand was up also.
Oh yeah, I just wanted to follow up on something that Peter said, and I actually agree. And I have to say, I'm not an urban designer per se, but in my view, I think the question of world making relative to cities is quite problematic. I see it more as a much more humble project, where that really kind of goes beyond the realm of speculation, which I'm taking from Peter's words, because one of the things that I find highly problematic is that large-scale corporations like Google, Apple, Amazon imagine their headquarters as a kind of world making. And I think that's a very, very different type of project, that understanding the multiplicity, diversity, and over-layering of what happens in a city. Cities can, I think that when we conceptualize urban environments in that light, it's a kind of hubris that we cannot escape from. And it really becomes adjacent to the power dynamics of relentless capitalism. But I think that cities have so much, urban environments have so much reactionary frameworks, not necessarily everything from bottom up, but there's so much power in the humble codependencies of different kinds of urban and social federations. And I think that if we think of urban settings in that light, kind of away from world making of grand ideas, that would be extremely important.
Thanks, Lydia. Ross, a response.
Sure. Yeah, I think, Lydia, I totally appreciate what you're saying there. I feel like when you say like big institutions and corporations and things are constantly world making, I completely agree. I also see institutions that operate with great power as world preserving, doing their best to preserve this world. And by world, what do we mean? I mean, I guess I'm thinking of a world of markets and capitalism, of neoliberal states that facilitate the flow of capital towards concentrated nodes and so forth. And I think that likewise, the idea of world making, the way I see it, is always something that should necessarily imply world destroying, like getting rid of a certain world, or letting a world pass that we maybe are trapped in at the moment, as sort of two sides of the same thing. And I feel like, maybe it's the wrong terminology, I don't know, but it's just another way of thinking about what you're talking about, that world making itself can be also built on a much more humble, and I think has to be built on a much more humble sort of framework of codependency, of forms of care, and mutual aid, and so on and so forth, things that people have talked about, and that can happen in sort of much smaller scales. But I nevertheless would argue that to me is a radical world making project, that one that sort of ushers in a different kind of horizon from the only horizon we've been presented with as the only alternative, right? Neoliberal capital. So, but yes, I think we're probably saying kind of the same things.
I think this is really, I mean, I'm realizing that, when I was in my head, that part of that phrase comes from the book from Hedda Rolvink and J.K. Gibson Graham about what they subtitle as performing diverse economies. And I think that's maybe where I'm sort of seeing it, that it's not necessarily how do we envision this like totalized scenario, but what does it mean to think about what exactly you're all pointing to, what's structuring some of these relationships, and some of those things that are so embedded they become hard to see. The joke about the fish in the water, like it's difficult to see beyond it, and so how do you start to kind of create space um, to do that, which I think is a number of the things that you're all pointing to around the sort of some of these methodological questions. Um, I know Adam has to run shortly. Adam, I just wanted to give you a chance to, if you had any sort of final thoughts before having to peel off.
No, I'm just grateful to have been part of the conversation. It was a pleasure to be on a panel with everyone here, and good luck getting this program off the ground. Very exciting. Thank you.
Thanks so much for your contribution, Adam. And we're just getting going, so you'll be hearing from us. But thank you again for everything. For the remaining panel, I would love to continue our conversation a little bit, and then we have some questions in the Q&A. One of the things that was coming up for me in hearing, I think it's super interesting to, not surprising, but I'm happy I'm not surprised. But, that everyone, the common denominator was this idea that the urban design is not necessarily the description of geometric relationships, but is much more about trying to understand and engage these much more complex processes. But nonetheless, those have spatial outcomes. And one of the things that I think a number of the contributions pointed to is the challenge of reconciling the scale. That there's a kind of there's a bodily scale that we share, but then even things that seem containable all have various forms of external consequences. And so I'm wondering, like, on one hand, the general question is if you have thoughts on the challenges of scale in the context of urban design, but I might put that in relationship to questions of sovereignty, because another one of the threads that has emerged is an idea of a certain level of local control, local authority, self-determination. And so I'm wondering how do we sort of square some of those things, because in this kind of context of these diverse economies, there often is some sense of what a smaller footprint might mean, but we also maybe understand that it's quite challenging to really become self-sufficient. And so I'm wondering, maybe, Lydia's presentation foregrounds that, the kind of limits of self-sufficiency, but I think it also extends to forms of governance and ideas there. So again, kind of wide net cast, but scale and sovereignty as they relate to urban design. I wonder if any of you have some reactions to that as a prompt.
I thought
Go,
Lydia
Sean, please.
would take that one. I thought Lydia was going to jump all over this one. No, my only thoughts. I mean, I think of Lydia's work, and you know, the mention of Elon Musk and the others who are prospecting in space, or who might be looking to escape governance in light of inevitable crises that might force us to reimagine our existence in very different contexts. So I do think, I mean, I've always appreciated Lydia's work in that regard, because it reminds us that it's inevitable that, and thus in real time, we are seeing the exploration happen for a number of reasons. And so, yeah, I think you know, Jesse, you point out that perhaps even as Ross was saying, the crises both identified by us and perhaps some of those crises that have not yet been identified by the public are prompting some aspects of our society to go ahead and launch these curious projects. And so they're not pet projects. I think they are very much what Ross says. They're reactions to what we know may inevitably be the reality. So, you know, and I you know, have to say, I learned some of this from following Lydia's work. So,
You're too kind. You're too kind for referencing me, and I wish we can soon meet in person. But I mean, I think of all of architecture design as shifting between scales. I think that you know, it's you cannot but think in this way, from the body to the mesoscale to the urban scale, and like that movement between different scales is what generates any kind of creative discourse and kind of multi-scalar understanding. And it was particularly, I mean, that's not answering the questions of the audience, which is about Latin American cities, but I found it particularly incredible throughout the pandemic how because of the immobility and the kind of stay-at-home mandate, we had to do that every day, like move between like different maps of transmission and you know, seeing faces in Zoom. And I was interested also on how you know, when at the very beginning stages of the pandemic, as a kind of anthropological experiment on spatial disorientation in cities, in urban environments, which you know, because people didn't move. So I think that I mean, I know we didn't speak about the pandemic, but here we are again in Zoom in a very different kind of format, where we're not specifically pinned to a location, and I think a lot of ways in the way that we use media and we conceptualize spaces and XYZ coordinates have really changed. And that's something that you know, I want to pass this on to Snoaria, which I really loved the presentation on AI and the kind of study on sewage and how it moves. But I think that, you know, just to say something last, and I'll have to unfortunately log off. I think it's incredibly important to think of what is resource and what is waste in a city. And that's kind of a lifelong project that I'm really deeply invested in. All of the things that, you know, I'm not interested in Mars at all. I'm just using it as an allegory. But how waste moves around and what becomes resource. And I think, Sean, you mentioned that in your presentation, that it's basically about extracting capital from the land and moving it around. And all of these relationships are extremely important. The city is not just a place of inhabitation. It is really also a massive way of extracting and moving around resources all the way around it. And these are not just statistical problems, they're design problems, they're experiential problems, existential problems. And And I hope we find ways to engage with them seriously in creative ways. I'm sorry I have to log off, but my children need me.
Thank you, Lydia. Yeah, I think
Thank you so much for having me, and it was really wonderful to see so many brilliant faces and friends today. Thank you.
Thanks, Lydia. Thanks for joining us, and thanks for sticking around, everybody. I think there's so much to say, and I'm glad, Lydia, that you took my cue around scale, because I wanted to sort of get on the table that we often talk about like the urban scale, but I think what for me is important is that there's not really such a thing in a certain sense, that there's always this incredibly dynamic set of relationships. And if we maybe use scale in more of the geographic sense, that might describe it more as level or set of relations and things like that, that this is one of the things that I hope we can relate to. I'm the kind of person with when I have a panel of brilliant people, I'm going to just keep asking you questions, but I want to, so thank you again, Lydia. I'll see you soon, I'm sure. There is a question from the audience around Latin American urban contexts. The question is that the topics of social inequity, climate crisis, and spatial unavailability can relate to different contexts of the world. What is your take on Latin American case studies? Have any of you had the chance to work on that region? And I would, I think I wonder, I mean, maybe I could start with Ross, potentially, since I know have a little bit of experience thinking about that.
Oh, I really don't, but I'm maybe I can ventriloquize Yvonne Santoyo, who's the co-director with me here at BARD, who's doing work on Latin American cooperatives at the moment. She has a number of pieces coming out, but also she's done work in the past on questions of the commons, the ejidos, and ways in which like forests are being quantified and turned into carbon markets and so forth. So I would recommend having a look perhaps at her work and forthcoming work that's going to be coming out in some recent, some new articles very soon, actually. So like eFlux and places. Have a look at some of the stuff there. I can't speak personally.
No, but I'm happy to be able to get some a plug for Yvonne's amazing work. One maybe as a final question for the evening, knowing that it's in no way a conclusive question, but one of the things that I'm really super curious to hear from everyone, and it was alluded to in the various presentations. We're all involved with teaching, and we all are endeavoring to do some kind of professional thing also. I'm wondering if I just would love to hear everyone's thoughts or whatever you feel like articulating around the relationship to what it means to teach people in the context of urban design to eventually go on to do something after they finish that program. So another way to say it might be, how might we think about what it is that we are preparing people to do, and what are some of the ideas for a changing, like if urban design is this thing that's constantly evolving, what does it mean to train urban designers, and how might we think about doing that to make sure that we can address the kinds of questions that we're asking each other and everyone to address. Peter, I see you're unmuted. Can I turn it over to you?
Yeah, so I'll take that one because I teach at scales. I teach from K to 12 and then undergrads and grads. And because my practice and the way I teach is deeply rooted in the city, it's ostensibly urban design. And so when it comes to sort of thinking about how this practice integrates into professional life and also in just the lived experiences of people, I think it's a unique opportunity to think how it integrates into multiple systems of learning. And so we never, at the K to 12 level, it's been a deliberate attempt to not create something separate called urban design or architecture, but really work within the system and infrastructure of the DOE to work with teachers, to work with communities, because they're such an integral part of the schools, to work with superintendents on ways in which urban design thinking can be a support mechanism for the sort of objectives of the classroom. And what this allows is to really sort of hone in on cultural responsive learning and modes of learning that allow for young people to immediately think of the way they're learning to support them being active participants in their communities and their neighborhoods. And urban design is uniquely suited for this kind of learning across all platforms of the humanities and sort of K-12 education. It's a sort of ideal vehicle for that kind of transformative thinking and learning. For all the reasons that as urban designers we know in terms of how the city and its systems functions and how we were immediately able to see that kind of one-to-one corollary. When it comes to sort of advanced students, again, it allows us to, again, sort of prepare our students for a world where they're able to sort of participate at a very sort of broad, thorough, and consistent level. Because it navigates both principles of design and policy in such a way that it almost insists that we both have to be sort of these speculative thinkers and create worlds, very much sort of world-making thinking, but also we have to be very rooted in sets of realities that govern the world we currently exist in. And so how does one begin to sort of navigate that unique challenge, I think is sort of the space for and sort of urban design as a kind of a scholarship and both a sort of a professional and academic practice. That is constantly sort of moving between a kind of invention and the way to situate itself in the world so that it's relevant and knowable and shareable.
Amazingly said. Sorry.
So I teach pretty much exclusively on computational practices in architecture and urban design. And I think the challenge there and also the beauty of teaching in this kind of niche field is that it's quite new. It's quite new, but it's also such a hot topic, right? Google's doing it, Autodesk is doing it. There's a lot of potential and hence the creation of this program. But I feel enormous responsibility in what I say and what I tell the students and what they do with their projects, in thinking, in exactly this question that you're asking, because they're going to take all of the skills that they're learning into the real world and do real world projects, right? So then as a result, I really think of teaching as kind of a co-knowledge making process. And that's kind of the beauty of teaching, especially at the graduate level, is that everybody is coming in with so much knowledge already and so much experience in various things. So they come in, and then also on the topic of computation, I think the younger generation really has such a rich relationship with computation and with all the tools that we use for computation, and that co-knowledge making process is what I think as the richest part of my my practice and my teaching, that I think hopefully is true for a lot of other kinds of teaching, non-computational related teaching as well, but I think it's just especially prominent because it's such a new field.
Thanks, Ryan. Yeah, I think that question of being able to engage the sort of things that are in progress, that are like so new that they require a kind of I mean, it seems like it relates to the same question of experimentation in a way, but it's at another level. Ross, please.
Yeah, thanks. I think one of the things that we're trying to do here at Bard is to see design practices like urban design and architecture as a way of seeing the world, not just as a way of as a professionalized practice to make things for the world around us. And when we do that, I think we begin to ask different questions about what architecture, what design is for. And one of the things that we can benefit from in a place like Bard, which is a liberal arts college, for those who maybe don't know, and it's not our program is not professional. We are inevitably dealing with transdisciplinary or even non-disciplinary forms of knowledge that really come into and shape the discourses and discussions and studios and things that we have. And I think it's so important, when you go through a professional school pedagogy like architecture, you come out being extremely, proficient and skilled in terms of design, but often, you're sort of introducing that into that world, let's say, or let's say it's difficult to necessarily know how to engage with questions that we all are facing, climate change, racial justice, and so on. And I think I would really advocate, especially in a new program forming right now, that we bring in more disciplines that maybe seem not even adjacent to, but maybe even somewhat farther away from practices of design, to be able to understand, that the world of design is always shaped by financial capital, by states and their relationship to capital, by the power structures that they exist within it, and that's never something we're taught. I always find it striking when I give my one lecture or two lectures, let's say, on what capitalism is to my students, because they don't know. No one in this society is taught about the core functioning of the society of capitalism, and I think that's something that would help tremendously in building a more robust and perhaps more feisty kind of practice that will, instead of providing solutions to problems, which are of course cooked up within our disciplinary constraints and common sense, to use design as a way to create more persuasive ways of being otherwise in the world, right? And then using design as propaganda for a kind of different way of being, let's say.
That's great. I like feistiness as a measure. I'm keeping an eye on the time. I think we should bring it to a close. I wonder, Sean, if you wanted to add any thoughts on this question of teaching vis-a-vis professional pathways.
Sure. Well, I couldn't agree more with everything that's been said. I mean, I think it's Area, Ross, Peter, Lydia, these are all important contributions to imagine how the discipline will evolve relative to our present condition and our future condition. At the center, we're obligated to work with the city, so we work closely with city agencies, but in being in academia, we can sort of depart from the immediacy of their kind of interest and think a bit longer term. And so we would not nearly be, I think, as successful without the cohort of economists, sociologists, anthropologists that we work with. Were incredibly informative. Understanding from my own perspective, as well said, I was trained as an architect, have a little bit of a data science background as well. And some of our graduate and undergraduate researchers at the center, just based on some of the skills that they've learned, how to work with urban data, some coding. As a matter of fact, I think, I was going to mention maybe offline, but I guess we'll be wrapping up soon. But we've had people from Sidewalk and Violet Whitney, and we've actually placed some students there from City College. And in part, I think the new skill sets and the language that they speak is very different than, let's say, someone coming out of a school in the 80s or even 90s with an urban design degree. And so picking up on the awareness of the digital natives and how they work with information, all across the spectrum, by the way. So, from communities to democratizing data so that they understand it better, up to the highest level of those who are actually doing the coding. We all know that AI learns from our behaviors, and the corpus And so just being aware of these things, it's such a whole new landscape and opportunity, I think, for an urban design program to kind of mine these new trajectories that have not been formally introduced into the canon, but figure out ways by which it'll influence it as we go forward.
Thank you so much, everybody. I'm inclined to move to adjourn this session to conclude episode 1 of our podcast here. It's super nice to hear everyone's thoughts, and I really appreciate everyone's complex thoughtfulness. It's really inspiring. I'm really excited about these conversations and the effects that they have and the possibilities that they can create. So so thank you, everybody, for your willingness to join. Thank you for the attendees for making space on a Monday night in the middle of the end of a term. I'm super grateful, and I really appreciate it. And with that, I think we'll conclude this session, and I hope to see you all in person. Can't thank you enough. Best of luck with the end of the term, and anyone, we weren't able to get to all the questions because of the time, but I'm available. You can find my contact information on the website if you'd like to know more about the program or things that came up in tonight's discussion. I'm happy to try to answer those questions. So with that, good night, everybody. Thank you again. Really appreciate it, and see you all soon. Take care.
Thank you.
Bob, always good to see you, Bob. Okay.
Bye,
Bye.
everyone.
All right. Be well.